one thing that I always remember about Bryan was just the way he took me in. He was a big brother to me, and I think for a lot of people, a lot of us in this business, Bryan raised us.
He created thought. He came from things in a different direction than most people would have thought about, hence him being as good of a columnist as there was.
He had a unique way about getting athletes to open up to him and talk to him in ways that perhaps they wouldn't with others. You know, a lot of professional athletes can be very guarded with what they want to say, but Bryan would spend enough time with them in the locker room, you know, often on NFL Sundays, hours after the game in the locker room, spending time with Steven Jackson to get to know him, you know, on a personal level.
There was a time just after 9/11, and this is when the United States was about to deploy troops in, I believe, Afghanistan, perhaps Iraq. And Bryan was in an airport, and he met some young soldiers that were about to be deployed. It was a fascinating column, and it just said a lot about Bryan's ability not just to write about games or players, but people.
One, I remember he wrote a piece where he tried to offer support for a baseball coach here in town at a small college who wasn't getting any support from the administration. And so here's a guy that was not the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals. He wasn't the big goal scorer for the St. Louis Blues. He wasn't the quarterback for the Rams. This was the college baseball coach of a non-revenue sport at a small college here, and Bryan took up his cause to try to make conditions better for him, and he wound up getting it. And that was his legacy. He wanted to make sure that, you know, people who couldn't speak for themselves, that he would give them that voice.
I would describe Bryan's style of journalism as direct, straightforward, no BS. He called it the way you wanted him to call it, and that's how he saw it. And he wasn't afraid to tell the truth.
You know, Bryan was the Post-Dispatch's first ever black sports columnist. So he, you know, some things he would write, people just wouldn't take to him. They didn't like to hear those opinions. Bryan questions, hey, why is Barry Bonds the most evil man on earth because of his steroid use? But why is Mark McGwire still beloved here in St. Louis, even though he's used steroids? So Bryan would ask those questions.
Bryan's legacy would be one of honesty, dedication, and respect for what he does for a living.
I think here in St. Louis he wasn't appreciated like he was across the rest of the nation. Now, if you turned on Sports Center, or if you turned on that show that he did up in New York, and then you'd say, oh, that's a guy that hangs around here. And you'd say, wow, I didn't realize that about him. But that's the kind of guy Bryan was. You didn't know how important he was and what a great standard that he had until somebody else told you. He wouldn't tell you himself.
I believe that St. Louis finally got it, unfortunately, after he passed, because people started seeing all the well wishes and the condolences coming from people like Magic Johnson, like Bud Selig, the commissioner of baseball, with all these dignitaries and all these famous people.
I didn't realize what a national impact he had on African-American sports journalists. And it just went on and on about how when they were young, Bryan helped them with this, or, you know, Bryan got me in the door here, or, you know. I was just amazed because all these years I've known Bryan, or had known Bryan, he had never mentioned any of these things. He had never name dropped. He was just so humble and so graceful and just so gentle. His impact, I think, will last for years.